Well, this was a unanimous decision by the full High Court bench. Why such clarity, do you think?
Well, I think it's desirable that it's such an emphatic result. I mean, there's just no room left for ambiguity. The highest court in the land has said that Cardinal George Pell was wrongly convicted. I think in the scheme of things, that's preferable to a divided decision, which would have just continued the public debate about this matter, which has already become very confused, I think, in the community and among commentators, caught up in broader questions of the sins of the Catholic Church. Child sex abuse by Catholic priests and the cover-up of the church. This case was not about that. This case was about whether Cardinal Pell committed the particular crimes with which he was charged.
Does this result declare George Pell innocent?
Well, it's a finding that the conviction was wrong. In other words, the jury, acting rationally, could not have been satisfied that he was guilty beyond reasonable doubt. Our system doesn't actually judge innocence. Our system judges guilt or not guilt. But a person who has been adjudged not guilty is, of course, entitled to the presumption of innocence. So it's not right. It would not be right to say that Cardinal George Pell was a convicted child sex offender. That's wrong.
Do you believe there is systemic issues in at least the Victorian judicial system, or are the safety nets working as they should be, the appeals court and then the High Court?
Look, this was a very high-profile case, so it's right that it's under a lot of scrutiny, but my view is this is the system as it is supposed to work. We have inbuilt checks and balances. There are 2 levels of appeal in cases of this kind, 3 levels in some other cases. Here what happened was a jury convicted George Pell. The Court of Appeal had a look at the matter and upheld the verdict. The highest court in the land had the second last look at the matter and came to a different view. That's the system working as it should. And it's better than happens in some cases. You know, we have had failings of justice, even at the High Court level in Australia. I mean, you think back to Lindy Chamberlain, whose conviction was upheld by the High Court in 1984. She languished in jail for another 2 years before she was ultimately released.
Will this have any bearing on a civil case?
Not in a strict legal sense, because the civil case would be between different parties and a different standard of proof would apply. The balance of convenience, the balance test rather than the beyond reasonable doubt test. But I think at a practical level, the fact that the judgment of the High Court was so emphatic and unanimous makes those cases less likely now.
What does this result say to victims, George Pell's accusers in particular?
Look, I think it's a tragic case at so many levels. I mean, I think particularly about victims of child sex abuse. It would be a terrible thing if they were discouraged from coming forward and telling their stories as a result of a result like this. I think about the fact that the public too often has conflated questions of the Catholic Church's shortcomings with the particular charges against George Pell. And I think about Cardinal Pell himself, who has spent 405 days in jail, having been wrongly convicted. I think it's a tragedy on all of those levels.
Do you understand why this has been so difficult for Catholics and non-Catholics alike? And there is a really huge divide that I sense in the Australian public at the moment about the message that this does send to victims. Perhaps this is a difficult question put indelicately by me, but does this court decision mean that essentially those accusers are being called liars?
Well, no, in fact, that's the very thing the High Court didn't say, and I hope that public commentary doesn't take hold. So the complainant in this case was found to be credible at every level of our judicial system, including at the High Court. So the High Court had no criticism at all of the victim's evidence. The victim was said to be a credible witness. The question for our courts is a different one. Was Cardinal Pell's guilt proved beyond reasonable doubt? And the High Court weighed the credibility of the complainant's evidence against the unchallenged evidence of a raft of other witnesses about the standard practices and things that happened around the cathedral at that time. And the court ultimately said, look, it wasn't safe to conclude beyond reasonable doubt that Cardinal Pell had committed the offences. But the question's not indelicate. It's a perfectly legitimate question to ask. We want to encourage victims of child sex abuse to come forward and report these abominable crimes by scandalous people, and anything which discourages that is to be deplored. So I would be terribly concerned if a decision like this did have that effect.